It will be available to you after the event. We'll send a follow-up email with the link to the recording as well as an evaluation.
Great, thank you. Jessica is going to be on point today. My voice is fading, so I will be looking at some of the questions that come in, and we'll be speaking at various parts of the presentation. So I'm going to pass the Zoom mic over to Jessica.
Yeah, thanks, Ralph. So thank you all so much for coming today. We're really excited to share more about what we've learned, not just through the actual project period, but since the project has ended. So we'll kind of go through 3 parts today: what we did, and what's working, and then what's next. And what we did will also include sort of what we learned and the impacts of the program. But we really want to leave a lot of time for questions. I know some of you submitted some in advance, but usually this presentation generates a lot of interest and questions, and we want to make sure we leave a lot of time for that. And so we'll do about 30 minutes of presentation, and then we'll have lots of time for questions at the end. So just make note of them. You can put them in the chat. Ralph will document them. And yeah, so with that, let's get started. So this project really looked at how sustainability and scalability of innovative digital tech can be explored and contextualized through embedded research translation. So there is a huge push between low, middle, and high income countries alike to digitize smallholder agriculture. And this really comes from a need and an interest to make sure that those smallholder farmers are included in the wider ecosystem for agriculture, making sure that farmers can take their products to market, that they have access to information, and other benefits of being included in the digital ecosystem. However, we tend to fall prone to introducing solutions without fully exploring or contextualizing those solutions to the populations that we intend to help. So in an effort to avoid a situation when helping hurts, this project really aimed to understand how this very unique and innovative technology may or may not be appropriate for smallholder farmers of African indigenous vegetables in Western Kenya. And it was really about a critical examination of whether or not blockchain technology, and this is not cryptocurrency, so I just want to make that disclaimer always up front, just the blockchain technology in and of itself can address the barriers or challenges that these farmers are facing in taking their indigenous vegetables products to market. And we really wanted to focus on vegetables because oftentimes we find when talking about food security, we get into cash crops because we know that improved income can lead to improved food security. But we also wanted to explore how making a nutritious product more available and the value chains function more efficiently if that was possible using blockchain technology, and really spotlight nutritious foods in our efforts to improve value chains. The embedded research translation model was a very interesting proposition from Laser Pulse, and something we really wanted to incorporate in our project design from the very beginning, to think about not only is it appropriate for smallholder farmers and how can working with a private sector company called AgUnity develop their product and adapt it to the value chain for African indigenous vegetables, but how could we use embedded research translation to cross this chasm? So I think we've all seen the innovation diffusion model, but we end up, especially in digital technologies, in this chasm between the early adopters and the early majority, all while private sector is facing this issue of cash flow, and this valley of death can be a huge barrier to achieving that scale and sustainability that we really hope to achieve with these technologies that can provide significant assistance in overcoming barriers and challenges that smallholder farmers face. But operating in the base of the economic pyramid is often complex and unique. Smallholder farmers in rural Kenya face different challenges than smallholder farmers in rural Uganda or Southeast Asia. So that was where the researchers came in. And so Virginia Tech, along with Edgerton University, located in Kenya, helped AgUnity to understand the complexities of what was going on in the ground. in order to help adapt their product and their business model as well. So as I mentioned, we're going to talk about what we did and what the impacts were. And then since the project ended about this time last year, we'll look at how it's going, what's happened since, and then where we go from here with this technology. So first of all, I just want to address the question of why blockchain. So blockchain can address deeply entrenched challenges in the value chain, such as unreliable or non-existent paper-based record keeping, opaque supply chains, and even exploitative behavior of brokers. And it really does this by creating records of information. It might seem simple, but that's really what blockchain is about. There are a lot of different technologies that you can use to create digital records, and we want to acknowledge that. Blockchain is not always going to be the solution. There are a lot of cloud-based digital technologies that can be used to store records. So blockchain is really when there's a lack of trust between actors. Once a digital record is created, that cannot be altered or changed. And so this is a really important point to users to emphasize how blockchain can create trust between actors due to the lack of ability to manipulate records or change information. And that information becomes more trustworthy. And our hypothesis was that this would create more trust between actors. But we really wanted to understand what was going on in the field to see if this is even an issue. What is the relationship like between people who are transacting with each other? And do the characteristics of blockchain in and of itself have the possibility to address some of the challenges within value chains for indigenous vegetables? So just briefly, I'm not a tech person, so this is my development practitioner, researcher explanation of what blockchain is. So very simply, it's just a method of storing information in a reliable and transparent way. So we are not using cryptocurrency. We are not getting into financial technology at all. This is really just about storing records. So this diagram here was provided by AgUnity and how their blockchain works. And so essentially what happens is I want to sell vegetables to Ralph. And so Ralph accepts the quantity and the price of the transaction with me. And then I confirm that the transaction actually happened. And this occurs by scanning a QR code on the phones that farmers, traders, and retailers have. So this happens at every stage of the transaction along the value chain. These transactions are then recorded as a block of information. And the important point about blockchain and how it differs from some other type of technologies is that the block is broadcast to every party in a network. So it's a distributed ledger technology. Those in the network validate the transaction, and then the block is added to the blockchain, which is a mutable record of transactions. And the point with blockchain is that because it's a distributed ledger, it's not impossible, but it's virtually impossible to change the record because you would have to change it on every single ledger that it has been distributed throughout the network. Otherwise, there would be a discrepancy and it would not be validated. So, and then once the blocks are added to the blockchain, they are secured using cryptography. So if you have questions about blockchain and how it works, I'm not your person. But I'm hoping actually that someone from AgUnity was able to join the call today. But that's the basics of how it works. So why African indigenous vegetables? So in Kenya and other countries in East Africa, there has been a return to demand for locally grown and these varieties of vegetables that are indigenous to the region, as opposed to vegetables that are referred to as exotic vegetables. So that would be cabbages, tomatoes, even spinach, some varieties of kale. There's been a return to interest in these products because of their nutritional and medicinal value, as well as sort of a return to the keeping culture, strengthening culture. So keeping out products that were introduced during colonial periods and wanting to make a return to these historical and heritage products that are important to the culture in Kenya. So we wanted to focus on this product, as I mentioned, because it not only supports income, so it's often grown and harvested and sold by women as an additional source of income for the household, but it's also an incredibly nutritious food. And so it supports food security not only for producers, but also consumers who are net food purchasers in the market. So the value chain for indigenous vegetables, though, is quite informal, and it's highly affected by seasons, and the transactions are quite gendered. So the farmers are often women, and then the traders are often men, and then retailers are back to women. And so there are a lot of different gender dimensions going on in the transactions and who holds the power in those transactions. Though we did find, and I can explain more about this later, that the retailers actually have the most power within the value chain. But we wanted to understand more about this and how technology might level out some of the power dynamics within the value chain. And there's also a possibility for export of these vegetables. And so we wanted to understand the value chain more and where some of the challenges might exist that would prevent or enable access to these export markets. So the company we worked with is called Agnew. They're an Australian-based tech startup. I think they're about 5 years old now. And we wanted to work with them first and foremost because of their willingness and openness to collaborating with researchers. They also take a very human-centered approach to designing their product. And so they're already very familiar with the idea of going to communities, trying to understand the barriers, the constraints, the opportunities, the wins, the opportunities, or sorry, the benefits that they have within the assets they have within their community. So, but the other amazing thing about their product is it's not just an app. So I wanted to mention that very early on. I think we all have certain ideas conjured when we talk about, apps, digital solutions. So it is an app, but it's not an app that you can just download from the Play Store. Agnew has developed an entire operating system. And the app is essentially a super app, which is really more like a platform. So their app is really more like the Play Store than an app that you would download from the Play Store. So this will enable them to offer other types of services like weather information or extension videos or access to markets, a way to procure inputs. So there's a huge range of opportunities that can be leveraged through their app. And they're in the initial stages of developing this platform, but they have this base level record keeping product already established. And so we really had something to work with already and something to adapt as we investigated the value chain. It's also award-winning technology. They've won numerous awards in various hackathons and different types of events across the world. And it is also adaptable to different value chains. So they had historically been working in coffee and cocoa, and we convinced them that nutrition is also a worthwhile endeavor. And so they were willing to get into this project with us. So in order to do that, in order to adapt their technology, we first started with a value chain mapping process, and we found different types of arrangements based on the area within Kakamega County that we were working in. So most of the producers of vegetables are smallholder producers. There's not a lot of mid-size production of indigenous vegetables. And then based on the location of the farmer, they were selling to different types of middle people, so small traders or large traders, even a community-based organization was in the mix. In Butere, for example, the value chain is much shorter and smallholder producers are selling directly to the retailers. So we also wanted to understand how successful the technology is in different types of market arrangements as well. We captured a lot of really important information that would help us to assess whether or not blockchain was the right type of technology to introduce into the value chain. And we found in the end that it was due to lack of trust and a lack of efficient operation throughout the value chain. So we were also able to identify opportunities and potential pitfalls that we could fall into as we tried to introduce this technology. So an example would be traceability. Blockchain can facilitate traceability throughout the value chain through its record keeping. However, there was no conceptualization of traceability in the value chain for indigenous vegetables. And so in order to keep all the vegetables separate along the value chain, there needed to be training, there needed to be the right packaging, and in transportation, keeping vegetables that are collected from certain farmers separate from others, we saw was going to be a very complicated process. So we knew we needed to walk before we ran. And so we really focused first on the record keeping component of blockchain, but we tried to introduce other things into the project to test whether or not traceability could eventually be something that we work towards in the value chain for indigenous vegetables. So we deployed we deployed about 60 phones to farmers, traders, and retailers, and one community-based organization in Kakamega County in Western Kenya. So I failed to mention, but it's important that AgUnity includes in their business model a plan to ensure that farmers have access to these phones, and that will include a financing model. However, for this project, we just gave the farmers the phones since it was a very formative research project and we engaged with the users a lot and asked them a lot of questions. We gave them the phones as well to de-risk participation. So we didn't want them to have to pay for the phone, only to determine that it was not actually a useful technology. And so we gave the farmers the phones. We provided a lot of training. There was an initial training, and then AgUnity eventually hired a local field officer to provide continual support to users. We, as part of the project as well, identified what were called Ag Champions. So these were nominated by different communities, and they received additional training, and they also helped AgUnity to provide training and support to the users of the phones when they were having challenges. And these Ag Champions were very often youth. There's something about the youth brain that understands phones. And so they were able to provide support to some of the older participants, and have also really helped to rally the different users around this concept of collaborative working along the value chain. We did a variety of evaluations. So we had a baseline evaluation, and as well as a midline last August, and then a final evaluation last November. We also did a hackathon at Edgerton University as a way of exploring a variety of different ways for youth to be involved in the development of digital solutions for agriculture. And so that, as I mentioned, AgUnity is a super app. And so you can add different types of applets. And so the students, based on the other challenges and barriers that we discovered during the value chain mapping, developed new applets that would address those challenges. So that was just one component of the project. We also engaged heavily in cross-sectoral engagement. So we've had a lot of meetings with different types of associations and cooperatives, the government, different private sector members all across Kenya, to continue to understand what blockchain's potential is in Kenya, what are the risks, what are the concerns, what are the opportunities, so that we can continue to engage with AgUnity and support the development of their business model through our expertise in this cross-sectoral engagement. And so we continue to do that to this day. We continue to work together and are identifying those opportunities. And then another really important component I just wanted to share briefly was the storytelling component. So we actually were able to film, from additional support from Laser Pulse, a documentary on the story of African agricultural ingenuity. So we did a short video, which I think Chris sent out with the announcement of this webinar, but we were actually able to film a longer documentary. It's about 25 minutes. That will be pushing through other film festivals. We're currently trying to figure out if it's possible for it to be released on Netflix or Discovery, a few other channels we're sort of exploring right now. But we really think it's important to mainstream stories of African agricultural ingenuity into the media that the public has access to, and telling the stories of the farmers and what their experiences are, and their interest in engaging globally. So I'll leave it there, and then just Ralph, I don't know if there's anything else that you wanted to add on what we did.
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. We did receive some great questions that people submitted when you signed up for the webinar, and I thought we would look at a couple of those at various points. So there was a question about how do we communicate the complexity of blockchain in a way that makes sense to end users. I think hopefully it's now clear that blockchain is really a really effective record keeping system. The data is immutable, it cannot be changed. And I think a nice way to think, a nice analogy here is it's a bit like the internet and the way we're using Zoom right now. We don't need to know the internet protocols, the transport control protocols behind how everything works on the internet. It sort of just works. So I think part of the blockchain piece is that it is working effectively in the background, and it basically gives the participants confidence that the transactions they're making cannot be changed, and it's immutable, and that's where the trust really comes in. We had another great question about the technical skills of farmers to use the blockchain technology. And really the only technical skill that they need is the skill to use and operate a smartphone. So if they can do that, they can use the app. And so the blockchain piece is not something separate that you have to understand blockchain for this all to work. It works in the background. And if the app is designed the way it is, it works effectively. You don't need to know anything about blockchain. So that's a nice feature of this. Another question was about how practical is the utilization of blockchain technology by ordinary citizens? Is it linked to cryptocurrency? The app and the system we're using, as Jessica mentioned, is not linked to cryptocurrency, so that's not part of what we did. There was also a good question about does blockchain introduce any risks to users that the status quo system wouldn't? So as we mentioned, there's no cryptocurrency connection. We did provide the phones to the participants as part of this project. So that sort of removed the financial risk from purchasing a phone. If the system is scaled up, and participants now do need to purchase their phone, there would be a financial risk associated with that. But what we have noticed is that once people have access to the smartphones, they use them for all sorts of things, listening to music and communicating and everything you can imagine the smartphone being used for. So there's an additional value that they would get out of the phone. So those are some of the great questions that were raised, and I'll come back to some more later. I'll pass back to Jessica.
Great. Okay, so and there will be opportunity at the end of the presentation to ask questions. I see 18 comments in the chat, so I'm assuming some questions are coming through there. But let us just share what we learned. So I'm an agricultural economist by training, and I have focused a lot on value chains over the course of my research and value chain development. And this, to me, was one of the most fascinating findings, was the way that blockchain improved coordination along the value chain. Oftentimes when we are trying to address value chain challenges, we end up focusing on different broken linkages sort of in sequence. And this addressed a lot of different broken linkages simultaneously. Because this blockchain-based app is not an app you use on your own. You would never just download a blockchain-based app. You on your own as a farmer, like, you have to be connected in this network. The trader you sell to has to use it. The retailer that the trader sells to has to use it, which does introduce some complexity in deploying and reaching a critical mass of users. However, once it is deployed and people understand the benefit of participating in this system, I could not believe how much the coordination between actors improved, all the way from standardizing bundles of vegetables that were sold, which increased everybody's revenue because there was a lot of variation. As you can see in the picture here, bundles of vegetables are sold by hand or are assessed by hand. So you see how many veggies fit in your hand, and that's the bundle that you purchase. And we were able to demonstrate to the different value chain actors how much variation and how much money they were actually losing because of the variability in the size and the weight of these bundles. And people started to trust each other more. There was improved relationships. They understood who was participating in the network. So they knew the people they could call to, if producers knew the traders they could call to come purchase the vegetables. They were arranging transactions ahead of time, and they were only harvesting what they needed. And so the post-harvest loss reduced significantly, and there was a lot more enjoyment in participating in the network. Women ended up growing more vegetables and getting more involved in the value chain for indigenous vegetables. So this is something that continues to give me a lot of energy and excitement about blockchain, is the way that it requires people to engage with each other in the value chain, and its ability to really create a rising tides, lift all boats sort of situation. So this was really exciting finding for us. So 92% of producers reported improved relationships with their buyers, which was really exciting. So again, as I mentioned, it really improves trust. So even the traders preferred to buy from producers using the AgUnity app. So we showed in the deployment, we're working with a very small number of producers and traders and retailers in the area. So of course, traders are still buying from non-AgUnity users. So there was preference given to those using the phones. The negotiations were easier and a lot more straightforward. They also had records of their previous transactions. So there was it reduced the debate around price because they had this record, this history of these transactions between them. And they eventually got to know each other better as people, as individuals. On the AgUnity app, it includes information about the user, so like profile picture, their name, and now they don't have to share that information with their buyer or their seller, but there was something about that, their identity in the value chain that came into play that really contributed to increasing trust. We saw an improvement in income and food security. So for women producers especially, we saw an increase of about an average increase of 30% in income compared to the same quarter in the previous year. So this came from improved income from on-farm activities, but it also increased income from off-farm activities because the value chain was a lot more efficient. Transactions were more easily arranged and executed. And so women were able to diversify their livelihoods, which we know is critical to long-term resilience. So we would want to continue to invest in this and possibly even provide additional trainings or access to other opportunities. Again, through the AgUnity app, there could be an applet that could share with women, other opportunities off farm that they could diversify their livelihoods through that digital technology. So the options are really endless, and another reason why we were really keen to work with AgUnity. We saw an average decrease of 2 points in food insecurity. So we use the food insecurity experience scale, which is, I think, a 7-point scale. It's been a minute since I have read my own report, but so it's 7 points. So to see a decrease in 2 points is really exciting. And overall, we just saw a reduction in the number of days or experiences of having to go without food or the food that they were looking for, nutritious food. So again, an increase in production of these vegetables helps to fill an important nutrition gap that was existing. So our main takeaway is that blockchain is great, but it can't just be blockchain. So again, this is kind of, to me, a very important message in digital solutions is that it's not just going to be a silver bullet, a one size fits all, like all those sayings, it's not going to be one thing that fills all the challenges. But when offered alongside of other types of technology and digital services, that we know also affects the functionality of the value chain, we think there's a lot of potential for blockchain to strengthen the functionality of value chains and ultimately contribute to improved income and improved food security. So these other types of services are going to create something they call in the tech world a stickiness, right? So blockchain itself is probably not enough to continue to incentivize users to use an app. But if offered alongside of these other services that address some other really major and difficult constraints to overcome, these technologies together through a platformization of agriculture have infinite potential to help smallholders improve their income and their food security in the long term. So Ralph, do you have anything else that you wanted to address on what we learned during the project?
Yeah, let me look at the questions that we received. So I think we've already responded to the question about, how could blockchain technology improve farmer profits? We saw an average increase of 30% of farmer incomes. In terms of the food security, we had a question about the research on food security. Jessica mentioned the framework we use. I'll drop a link in the chat in a moment to the actual food insecurity framework. There were 8 elements to it, I think, so you can read all about those when I drop the link in. Oliver put a really good question in about applying this technology to food standards, and I think one of the things we did, as Jessica mentioned, we had grade A versus grade B vegetables. Grade A vegetables were washed, so there's elements of sort of food safety potentially coming in there. I think an important thing to think about is the sort of the platform that's being provided here by this technology. If you begin to add the kind of Internet of Things to that platform, you can start thinking about how you could track safety of food processing throughout the process, and have various moments where that evidence that this has been done to the vegetables, for example, is put on the blockchain, and you can begin to communicate what has been done to keep food safe. And so I think as a platform, there's great potential for this sort of system to actually, yes, track the quality of food, and actually to implement food safety standards, and have sort of a way to go back and see where did what action occur. So I think a great question, and I think there's a lot of potential here. We didn't do that in this particular study, but there is a lot of potential to do that. So
I can just quickly comment on that, because I'm not sure I did mention, I think I failed to mention the grade A and grade B. So I did mention we wanted to understand the potential for traceability. So collaboratively with farmers and a professor of agronomy at Edgerton University, standards for grade A and grade B were defined. And so that included, so we didn't want to call it organic and inorganic, because that can create some consequences within the value chain where farmers who are maybe not growing organic could end up losing out on income. So we did this, defined it more as grade A and grade B, where grade A vegetables were organic based on like the fertilizer use, pesticide use. And then there were other characteristics that were used to define the quality as well, in terms of like blemishes or other, whether or not it was washed, those types of characteristics. And we just wanted to see, like, is it possible to keep those vegetables separate throughout the value chain? Are consumers willing to pay more for grade A vegetables? So there were a lot of challenges, to be honest, on keeping those vegetables separate. It would need a lot of investment in infrastructure, even if it's minimal like intensity infrastructure, but even just packaging, like how do you keep those things separate? Like that would be a whole project in and of itself. But there's definitely possibility there. And even lower income consumers and peri-urban rural consumers are willing to pay quite a significant price premium for the grade A vegetables. There's growing concern about pesticide use in Kenya on fresh produce. So that there's definitely possibility there. And also for export markets, when you can minimize the human interference, which is really important, because blockchain is just going to secure the information you give it. So if you give it fraudulent information, it will just secure fraudulent information. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done there, but I definitely think there is possibility to explore that. All right, maybe I'll just move on to how it's going. So through word of mouth and advocacy of the ag champions, there's been significant interest in participating in the Ag Unity network. More than 100 youth actually in the region are interested in engaging with vegetable farming if it's tech-based. So we have one youth that participated in the project that has just been extraordinary, and he has been really rallying interest amongst his friends and his peers around this. And these youth are really keen to be saving for phones and start to participate in the Ag Unity network. So in an effort to continue to scale and sustain this work, Ag Unity has established a kiosk through a partnership with a community-based organization. And so this kiosk has a dedicated employee, and they have actually provided the community-based organization with office furniture and I think possibly a computer, but I can't remember if that officially happened yet. But essentially what they're piloting is that partnership with a community-based organization can help to accelerate scale, because it exists within the context of the farmers' lives. So farmers are already coming to this community-based organization's offices every week. And so then if anybody needs tech support, they can bring their phone to a location that they're already coming to. They are familiar with and they trust the coordinator of this CBO. And it also gives them access to all of the farmers within the CBO. So through just their own financing, they sent another 40 phones to Kakamega, where farmers have been saving for a deposit. And then Ag Unity has developed with the CBO a repayment schedule, again, that fits in with the context of the farmers' lives. So if you're interested in that, how that financing works, I'd be happy to explain more about that later. However, so we have seen a significant drop off in transactions, especially in the last few months. So we've been trying to understand what's going on. And what we have found is that the children of the farmers are deleting the app off of the phone, and so that they can download music from YouTube. So it's a really important point that people have many different types of needs, but because the app is not in the Play Store, and because it's you need an APK link to download the app, it's not so easy to get it back onto the phone. So that is one challenge with the product design. It is possible, I think, from Ag Unity's side to prevent the app from being deleted, and so now they're looking into that as part of their product roadmap. But then also not wanting to interfere with the user's autonomy and their decision-making around what they use the phone for. So it's a bit complex, but they're exploring that right now. Traders have left the area, unfortunately, and so we only had a few traders to begin with that were participating. So even if a couple leave, that kind of creates a breakage in the network. And then some of the ag champions actually left for a period of time. They went and got more training for vegetable production, and kind of left the region. Or a couple were sick, so that has really impacted the encouragement that is needed, especially amongst older users of the phone, to be able to, or in continued use and transacting through the blockchain. The other thing is that markets really need to be developed, and that's kind of outside of the scope of what Ag Unity does. And it's a really important point that I think in order for digital solutions to be scalable and sustainable in these types of agricultural environments, it's critical to have partnerships. So partnering with projects, possibly USAID funded, or other types of development work that's going on, initiatives of the government. We really need to see partnerships and multi-sectoral efforts come together in order for these digital solutions to be able to produce the results that we think they can. And also users need more training. It's a constant process to really feel comfortable with the phone. Many users had never used a smartphone before. And so Ag Unity is incorporating that into their service delivery. And that's one of our critical takeaways for digital solutions. It's not just about the app or how cool it is and how easy it is to use. There also has to be a service delivery component. So how many kiosks do you have? How many field support officers do you have? Where do people go to get help? How do they get help? What if their phone isn't working? So what is the service delivery that comes alongside of this digital solution? And so we're continuing to engage in this in the embedded research translation process. So we continue our collaboration. We continue to meet regularly, even though we don't have project funding. And we're working towards that. But we continue to work together with our knowledge of agricultural environments on the ground and constraints that we know often arise. We're helping to AgUnity to continue to advance their business model and their service delivery. And AgUnity continues to collect information and feedback to inform their product roadmap from their field officer. And they hope to soon have more than one field officer and to continue to expand those operations. So Ralph, I'll turn it over to you for any thoughts. Otherwise, I can quickly just explain where we're going from here, and then I want to open it up to questions. This has taken longer than I thought. It's very
Well, we're addressing some of the questions as we go.
Oh, great. Okay.
I got a couple of questions here from Christine. So were you able to determine the level of adoption, use of blockchain among the smallholders in your study context? And then the second one was, what would be the biggest challenge in implementing this technology among smallholder farmers? I think just briefly, I think the participants in the study did use and adopt the technology, definitely while the study was running. I think the biggest challenge is, we only had about 60 phones in play, and we had a value chain that we sort of curated. We had the smallholder farmers, we had the traders and the retailers all agreeing to participate, and these were all individuals who were in the value chain that we were looking at. And so if one or two people move out of a region and they're key actors in the value chain, you've got a problem. So I think the challenge is a bit like that innovation graph that we showed earlier. You need a sort of a critical mass of people using this approach. So when people do leave, it doesn't create problems for the value chain. So I think that's something to bear in mind. There's the critical mass element. We had another question from Catherine. Is the app already available? And is the app suitable to be used by food supply centers? You cannot download the app to use it, as I think Jessica, maybe you can say a few words more about how it actually gets put on the phone if you want to. I think the app can be used by food supply centers if they have an interest in tracking what's happening along the entire value chain, from where the food is produced, what happens to it along the supply line until their point and beyond. So I think, again, having very strong connections with your network partners and a real purpose for why do you want the information and how will you use it, I think if there's good answers to that, it could be a very useful technology.
Yeah, I would say if you're interested in that, I would actually recommend a different company, which is called Cropin, and they're based out of India. And their blockchain solution is much further along in the development of the traceability functionality. And their business model is more business to business. So they would deploy their solution to like a, I'm trying to think, like a food processor who would then, and the food processor would then take that product and the app to their producers and say, we'd like you to use this. And so it's the business, the processor that's driving the implementation of the use of the app. And so actually I have a PhD student, I'm hoping will focus her dissertation on this. I don't know if I've convinced her yet, but the differences in models. So AgUnity would be like a business to consumer. So they're driving adoption of the technology from the consumer level, which would actually be the producer, the trader, the retailer. Whereas Cropin is a business to business. So they're driving it from the processor or supplier level in order to convince people to adopt. So we're very curious about, what impact that has on smallholder farmers and autonomy and all those types of things. So yeah, anyway, there are those technologies out there. I'd be happy to talk more with you about that and get you connected to AgUnity or Crop-In if you have interest in that. So maybe just quickly, I can just wrap up. So really, in order to scale this technology, we need to think about what the priority value chains are, what are the opportunities, and ultimately who should be involved in scaling. And I can share these slides with you, but we've realized a variety of things in terms of the value chains that we should focus on. For example, I would not introduce blockchain into the value chains for maize in Kenya. Those are very structured, they already have really strong systems and forces at work. So I would maybe start more with like indigenous vegetables or potatoes or poultry, things that are not incredibly political. And also considering the potential access to trade markets, I think this should be a huge priority in terms of research and development. And the traceability and the standards in effect within a value chain also need to be considered in thinking about how blockchain can address some of those solutions to help create more transparency within the value chain. So again, thinking about what are the priority opportunities, making sure that we actually apply blockchain to situations and contexts that need blockchain, and then mapping other digital solutions that may be more appropriate in certain contexts, I think will be really important in identifying the opportunities where we can scale this technology. But most importantly, and what I always want to be at the center of everything that we talk about, is that farmers need to be at the table in designing the ecosystem, the technology, the solutions, but there are also a lot of other people that need to be part of the ecosystem as well, including youth and the government initiatives around information and communication technologies, international organizations. A lot of different players need to be at the table, and the ERT process provides a really good framework for how to engage with one another so that this is not happening in a siloed approach, but it's developed through an ecosystem perspective. So we have a kind of a few different ideas about kind of where to go from here. To me, the most important things are designing service delivery that's going to facilitate scale and sustainability, the complementary service development, and research. So we really need more rigorous evidence about where blockchain is most relevant, where it needs to be deployed, and how it is deployed. And then also the difference in these business models, as I mentioned. Also making sure that the technology is accessible and that we're designing risk mitigation as we go along in this. So to that end, Virginia Tech is actually going to be starting a blockchain and agriculture initiative where we aim to answer some of these questions, conduct this high quality research, co-design technology, the technology and the implementation of it, that service delivery, trying to mobilize investment and donor opportunities, and engaging in policy advocacy and recommendations of solution sets and value propositions. So we really want this to be multi-sectoral, multi-partner. So if you have any interest in participating in this, or you just have, you're from an organization on the ground and you'd like to explore possibilities to work together, please don't hesitate to reach out. But with that, I'll end our formal presentation, and then we can maybe address some more of the questions that are coming through. Ralph, I don't know if you've found any others that you want to address.
We have had a couple more come in. George was asking about how many farmers we've onboarded and so forth. I put a link in the chat to all of the reports. So everything we did is detailed there. We had 60 sort of main participants involved, the majority of which were small-scale farmers, smallhold farmers. So it was not a big number, but it was enough to kind of do a proof of concept, which was what this project was all about.
And I think since then, I think they've onboarded, or they're currently onboarding another 30 farmers, and then a couple traders and a couple retailers.
Yeah. a good question from Maya is about can we talk about the long-term financial sustainability? And what about the apps and its ecosystems, the kiosks that you mentioned, Jess? How would this all be supported by a revenue generation sort of approach? I'll say one thing, and then I'll let Jess jump in on this. We did ask questions about, would you be willing to pay sort of a monthly fee to use the app? And would you be willing to purchase a phone if this became sort of available? And there was a sort of a pulse saying, yes, we would be willing to do that, but there would need to be other services sort of bundled in and combined. And that's where this sort of super app platform can be quite useful if you can think of it like a Play Store. I think that's the best way to think about it, where you could download extension agent sort of information app. You could download pest control, that kind of thing. You could have weather, you could have other things all in that operating platform. So I think there's an interest in that bundled provision of services. And I think that's the key thing that we learned from this project.
I think too, Agunity is essentially exploring revenue models that would not be dependent on the farmers. So like perhaps farmers pay a monthly service, or users, not just farmers, traders, retailers pay, a monthly service fee. We're talking like $1 a month, and flexible payment terms. So Agunity is willing to collect that, seasonally. So when your harvest comes in, but so because they're a platform, what would companies be willing to pay to have their app on the Agunity platform? And essentially Agunity can be an honest broker of the different types of services that are available, and exploring that as a revenue model. Or, Twiga Foods is in Kenya, so them being a client, and helping Twiga to engage with smallholder farmers, which they've had a challenge with. So I think we've had some really exciting conversations about other ways of creating financial viability that are not actually dependent on the farmer at all, which creates space for ensuring that last mile inclusion, which is central to Agunity's business model. But like I mentioned, like Crop-In, I think they're a multi-million-dollar company. They sell that as a service to processors, to the companies that can afford to pay those services. So I think we have to continue to make sure we're designing business models that are equitable and fair and are not going to exploit smallholder farmers. But I think there's room to develop sort of innovative financing mechanisms.
I think I've spoken to all of the questions that we received in the chat. So if you do have any last questions, please either just unmute or type them into the chat. And it's great that we have such a global audience. I was reading everyone's location around the world. So thank you for making the time to join us today. So I guess if there's no other questions, we've probably reached the end of our session. And from my end, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. And we're always willing and happy to speak with anyone who wants to learn more about what we did and what we plan to do in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming.
Thanks, Ralph. Thanks, Jess. Just a quick note, watch out for an evaluation of the event coming up. A link to the recording, I just put it in the chat, and then stay tuned to hear more about our next event. Thank you all.
Great, thank you.